Hi everybody, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to take a look at a little bit of trappy chess play, and in particular, the idea I have in mind for today's show is to win by using traps, but not necessarily your own traps, but your opponent's traps. You'll see what I mean shortly, but the idea is basically this. If you cultivate an attitude of, let's say, prophylactic thinking, where you're always concerned with trying to figure out what is my opponent up to? What's your opponent up to? When you do that, you'll often spot your opponent's traps in advance. That's the first stage. The second stage is to take a very careful look at these traps and see if there's some way in which, well, to see if there's some place in the opponent's idea that has a hole in it. And if you can find such a place, and there are usually a couple of different ways in which you might do this. You might find an alternative variation that deviates before the main line, or you might find that you can go all the way down the main line and then have a little surprise waiting for him at the end. So by doing this, that's often a very effective way to pick up some points. Now, it requires a number of skills, of course. So one is, again, this skill, this habit of prophylactic thinking, of really trying to figure out what your opponent is up to. And it also requires both a degree of imagination and patience. So imagination in that you don't sort of just take your opponent at his word and just assume that, okay, this variation works, but you start to look and kind of sniff out and see if there's something that you can do. I'm reminded of Ronald Reagan's brilliant diplomatic phrase. It's a diplomatic oxymoron at that. Trust but verify. Of course, the whole point is that if you're verifying it, you don't really trust what the other person is up to. You don't really take them at their word. You're trying to make sure, or at least you don't trust them that much. So trust but verify your opponent's trappy ideas. So that's another skill that's required. Also, of course, there's patience, and that is again related to this in that, okay, you see this idea, you've calculated it out, your opponent's trap, that is, but you're patient and you see, okay, well, wait a minute, I'm not going to rush on to the next variation and try to figure out how I avoid the trap, but you stop and try to see, okay, is there some place where I can maybe improve? So all of these, of course, go together. You have to, of course, keep your eyes open for your opponent's possibilities, and once you see them, to kind of critically investigate them. And sometimes you'll end up with something really wonderful happening where you're able to use your opponent's ideas against him. One of the great masters at this art of winning by falling into his opponent's traps was Mikhail Tal. And we're going to take a look at an example from his career. And this was played against Anatoly Banik in the 1957 Soviet Championship. Tal has black here, and he's slightly better. White just played rook from d1 to d2, and plans to double on the d file. So that's White's idea. Black, for his part, wants to create some attacking chances, and plays e3, which breaks open White's pawn structure. So f takes e3, queen e3, and now Banik should have played king to h2. Had he done this, the position would have been slightly better for Black, but nothing too serious. White would continue with rook c to d1 and queen to g1, trying to evict the black queen and put some pressure against the knight on d4. Black might have to play c5 at some moment, but that would allow bishop to d5 and give White reasonable play with his bishops. Okay, the bishop on c3 is neutralized because it's the knight on d4 is in White's face, but still, the position is only a little bit better for Black, nothing too serious. But instead, Banik played the move queen to f2. And this is quite logical in some respects. He's offering a trade of queens. He's threatening the bishop on f6. He's piling up on the knight on d4. And he's also preparing a little trap here. And what that trap is, well, I think trying to figure that out would be a very good exercise for you. So see if you can figure out what Banik's idea is, what the trappy idea he's got in mind is. And then, of course, see if you can figure out how Tal is going to bust it. All right, so good little exercise. See if you can figure it out. Okay, well, the basic trap is probably not too hard to find. So the idea that Banik had was that after knight takes e2 check, rook takes e2, queen takes c1. Okay, this is clearly the obvious flaw with what Banach had in mind. Flaw in scare quotes. But after rook to e1, all of a sudden it looks as if black is just completely lost. The queen's under attack, and the bishop on f6 is under attack. And on some normal continuation like queen to c2, queen takes f6 is just the end of the game. It's going to be mate on g7 or h8 next, unless black sacks the queen, and then, of course, that's hopeless too. Further, there's a nifty variation after rook to e1, where Tal might try and move like rook to d1. Well, this also loses, and this is part of the trap. Queen takes f6 again, rook takes e1 check, and now not bishop takes e1, which would be losing for black. Losing for white, but king to h2. And once again, the game is going to be won for white. So queen g7 mate is threatened, and even after king f8, there's queen h8 check, followed by queen takes b8 with the won game. So that was Banach's idea. It's quite nice, but it has a fatal flaw. Did you spot it? Well, here it is. Bishop takes c3. So Tal was alert to this diagonal problem. So it's not only black can get killed on this diagonal, but white too, thanks to this. So after bishop takes c3, rook c1, bishop to d4, it turned out that white was dead lost. And for some reason he played this position out for quite a while, went another 15 moves or so, but this is just really hopeless, and Tal had no difficulty converting his advantage. So there's a kind of classic example. Tal did this many times in his career, but it's a skill that we can all cultivate. Now, let's turn now to an example of an opening trap, or an opening counter trap, if you will, where the same principles apply. So this occurs in a variation, relatively little known variation nowadays, called the Dutch Gambit, and it's characterized by this move c5. Maybe most accurately it's the Dutch Gambit after c takes d5, c takes d4, which is the main line. But we'll look at a sideline here with knight f3. So the trap gets set up with the move c takes d4, knight takes d4, and e5. Now here, white could make a normal retreat like knight to c2 or knight to f3. And after knight f3, d4, knight to d5, bishop e7, we have an approximately equal position that can be played, well, reasonably for either side. Both sides have their trumps. But white might also try to set a little trap for his opponent with knight d to b5. Now, of course, given a free hand, white would just love to play knight takes d5, or bishop takes f6 and then knight takes d5. Now, the reason why this is a little bit of a trap that white's setting is because it looks as if